What's up guys, Asian here with the first of our video series taking a look at a couple of misconceptions and misinformation, common misinformation in ESO, and trying to clear up some of those misinformation and misconceptions. So this first video is going to be centered around taking a look at skill tooltips as well as the character sheet information and basically explain how they aren't really painting a complete picture, the limitations of using those statistics to kind of determine how good your build is and so on. So the first one we're going to be talking about will be the tooltips, kind of how tooltips are calculated out and why they can be a little bit misleading. And then we'll move on to the character sheet and also discuss how the character sheet, including the advanced stat sheet, can also be misleading as well. So first, the tooltip. So here I have an old build video that I made way back in Greymoor, so this is about a year and a half ago, just taking a look at one of the tooltips for a Magicka Templar DPS ability that I'm not sure if people are still using on Magplar, but it was one of the first tooltips that popped up when I just was randomly scrolling. So this is the tooltip for Solar Barrage, and as you can see here, it has the description of what the ability does, the cast time, the target, the radius, the duration, the cost, and then a description above that includes the amount of damage that you do, and if it is a dot, so how much, if it's a dot, how many times is the damage done. So here it's every 2 seconds for 10 seconds, as well as any other additional effect that you get. So for example, here you get Empower while this ability is active, at least you did back in Greymoor. So this particular ability, as it stands right now, will deal 1884 magic damage every 2 seconds for 10 seconds. How is that 1884 magic damage calculated? So basically, what are the stats that go into determining the actual tooltip information that you're seeing here? That is determined by what are called skill coefficients. So this page here, you can find it on UESP. If you just Google UESP skill coefficients, it should be the first result on Google, and it'll show you pretty much all the different skill coefficients for pretty much every single ability in the game. They might be missing a few, but for a lot of the player abilities at the very least, they have all of the skill coefficients here. So I have pulled up the skill coefficients for Solar Barrage here, and you can see here that in this spreadsheet you have the verbal description word for word of the ability itself. Then you also have basically where the tooltip damage would be. So this $1 would be that tooltip information, that 1884 that we saw earlier. So how is this calculated? That's on this last column of this spreadsheet here. So here we can see that Solar Barrage, let's take a look at Solar Barrage 4, has this as the calculation for the tooltip. So you can see it uses max Magicka. This is your max Magicka. Uses your spell damage here with your SD, and then some constant value here. So you can see here that these are the coefficients, hence for this equation, hence why these are called skill coefficients. And you can see that they change as you move up in rank. So you can see here the skill coefficient starts at 0.0247 for Magicka and jumps up to 0.0256 once you hit skill rank 4. But the most important thing here that you can see is that it only uses Magicka and spell damage when it comes to determining the amount of damage that is shown on the tooltip. So that 1884 that we saw earlier, that is based solely on my character's max Magicka and spell damage. It does not take into consideration things like weapon done modifiers. It doesn't show you how much critical damage you would do, so it doesn't take into consideration your critical damage modifier. And obviously there's a critical chance, so it won't show you the probability of, how many times you might crit. That's on your character sheet, but it will not be reflected on your tooltip information. Another thing to keep in mind here is that your tooltip will assume that you are penetrating fully. That is, whatever your penetration value is, gets completely through your enemy's resistances. So remember, most instances, so dungeons and trial monsters, including bosses and ads, they have a resistance value of 18,200. So if your penetration is less than that value, you'll be hitting less than what's on your tooltip, assuming that you don't have any other sort of buffs and things like that active at the same time. So all that means to say is that whatever you see in your tooltip is not a complete picture. For starters, it assumes that you're able to penetrate basically all your enemy's resistances, which might not necessarily be the case, particularly in solo content where your penetration is going to be potentially lower because you're missing out on several important debuffs. It also doesn't take into consideration things like damage done modifiers, because it only takes into consideration your max Magicka and spell damage when you're taking a look at the tooltip information. On top of that, there are certain traits and certain sets where the spell damage modifier is a conditional modifier, so I'm thinking particularly of Bloodthirsty, but you can also think of things like Spell Strategist, for example. Those spell damage modifiers, because they're not presented on your character's sheet information, your character sheet information, that actually isn't reflected on a tooltip either. So something like Bloodthirsty, for example, the additional spell damage that you're getting, that will not be reflected on the tooltip. So let's say you're fighting something at 90% health, then you are at 50% health. If you stop combat and took a look at the tooltips, you'll find that your tooltip is not changing between 90 and 50, even though you have Bloodthirsty on, and you should be having higher spell damage. And that's because that spell damage bonus from Bloodthirsty is not being reflected on your character sheet. So, talking about character sheets, let's go ahead and move on to your character sheet information. So all this information is coming from this article from ESOU.com. There will be a link down in the description below to this article if you guys want to read this through in its entirety. But here's a screenshot of the PC UI of your character sheet. This is the basic character sheet information. You can see here you have all of your max stats, spell damage, spell crit, weapon damage, weapon crit, and so on and so forth, penetration, resistances, and all that stuff. That's all fine and dandy, but you're obviously are going to be missing a lot of important modifiers here. So the most important one being, and I mentioned this earlier, your damage done modifiers. That is not reflected here on your basic character sheet information. If you go ahead and hit advanced stats, you'll see that you have things like your core ability costs. Again, you'll notice that we don't have our damage done modifiers. You'll see you have your resistances. You scroll down further on your advanced stat sheet, you will find that you have your critical damage bonus, so you'll be able to see how much additional damage that your critical hits do. You'd also see any sort of additional damage modifiers you have to specific damage types, so bleed damage, disease damage, fire damage, etc., etc. But again, it's not reflecting your damage done modifiers, and your damage done modifiers do make up a sizable proportion of your amount of damage that you're able to do. So things like Minor Berserk, Major Berserk, Boss Ace, Minor Slayer, Major Slayer, those are not reflected on your character sheet information. And all of those damage done modifiers are obviously improving your overall damage. So a build that has very high spell damage, while it looks impressive on the spell sheet, on your character sheet, it might actually end up doing less damage overall because you might be missing out on several damage done modifiers. So for example, if you're running, let's say, Julianos or Spell Strategist instead of Boss Ace, yes, there is a chance that you will have higher spell damage on your character sheet information, but because you're missing out on the additional damage done modifier from Boss Ace, you might not be doing the same amount of damage with those two sets. Speaking of Spell Strategist, going back to these, the idea of sets and other sort of traits that are conditional modifiers, those conditional modifiers are not reflected on the character sheet either. So Bloodthirsty and Spell Strategist, again, being the two prime examples that I can think of. Bloodthirsty increases your spell damage the lower your enemy's health gets, but that is not going to be reflected on your character sheet information because that is a conditional increase. The game itself is not intelligent enough to know you're targeting something with 50% health, so your spell damage should be this because you're wearing 1, 2, 3 Bloodthirsty pieces. The game is not smart enough to do that math for you and reflect it on the character sheet information. If you think about it, it makes sense. Because the way Bloodthirsty works, it would have to change and update your spell damage on your character sheet every time you select a different enemy with a different health percentage modifier. Same thing with Spell Strategist, except Spell Strategist works a little bit differently. Spell Strategist works because it's a debuff that's applied to the enemy. The game checks if you're attacking something with the Spell Strategist debuff, and then it adds on the spell damage bonus from Spell Strategist if it detects that you are targeting an enemy with that debuff. Because it's a conditional effect, again, it's not reflected on your character sheet at all. On top of even more confusion, Certain spell damage modifiers, weapon damage modifiers, are also not affected by major or minor sorcery or brutality. The key example of this is Bloodthirsty. Bloodthirsty, that additional spell damage, weapon damage bonus that you get from it, it is not impacted by your major or minor buffs, sorcery or brutality. So not only do you have to take into consideration these sort of hidden modifiers, these conditional modifiers not being reflected on your character sheet, but some of these modifiers, Bloodthirsty being the prime example, are not affected by major or minor sorcery or brutality. So your character sheet information is still not complete even with spell damage. Basically, the way the character sheet works is that it only reflects buffs that are on yourself. So anything that is attached to you, your character, is reflected on the stat sheet, with the exception of damage done modifiers, because that is not on the advanced stats UI, at least this that I pulled from ESO. So your character sheet is also going to paint an incomplete picture. Now, particularly on console, I have noticed that there is there's a trend of people who believe that the higher your tooltip damage or the higher your spell damage or max magicka is on your tooltips or character sheet respectively means that your build is stronger than something that has lower values, and that's not necessarily going to be the case because of the reasons that is described above. Tooltips are incomplete and your character sheet information is also incomplete. The only way to really tell if your build is better than another is to compare the two builds by parsing, whether that be through actual trials performance or through a 21 million dummy parse. Obviously, the dummy parse is going to be under a more controlled environment, so you'll get more consistent results. But an in-trial performance might be a better indication of how a build performs because you will have a better idea of how it sustains and how it interacts with the groups, whether or not you're doubling down on certain buffs or debuffs, etc., etc. So all that is to say, don't necessarily rely solely on your tooltips or your character sheet information to tell you how good your build is, because it is missing key information. And particularly in tooltips, it's it's an assumption that might not necessarily be true at all points during a fight. But that pretty much concludes this video. Hope you guys have learned something, and I'll see you guys later.